Om Tava Kathamritam Taptajivanam Kavibhirididam Kalmashapah Sravanamangalam Srimatatatam Bhuvigridanti Puritajana. This is an introductory verse from the great well-known devotional classic Bhagavad Purana. Literally it means this is a nectar in the form of spiritual wisdom which keeps our mind oriented towards God and it destroys our impure tendencies and it fills our mind with spiritual thoughts, purifying our mind. And blessed people all over the world sing the glory of the Lord. That's literal, more or less, the free translation. Now we are reading from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. The date is Sunday, December the 14th, 1884. Sri Ramakrishna is visiting the well-known Star Theatre in Kolkata. He is taken there by one of his disciples, Girish and Ghosh. I mentioned his name yesterday. Girish and Ghosh is a very interesting character in the divine play that was Sri Ramakrishna's life. As I said, there were spiritual seekers of all categories who came to Sri Ramakrishna. Some of them were devotees, some of them have been practicing meditation and prayer for a long time. Some of them were young students, some of them were agnostics, even atheists, non-believers. And there were many wandering mendicants and monks, devotees. And one of them was a well-known playwright, a literary figure. He is supposed to be the father of modern Bengali theatre. His name was Girish Chandra Ghosh. He was a genius and also a profligate. He was a drunkard, at the same time a man of strong spirits, strong spiritual aspiration, but sometimes somewhat perverted. Now, this man had many drawbacks, but he had one great characteristic. He was a man of tremendous integrity. He openly said that he can't practice spirituality. He cannot do spiritual practices. When Sri Ramakrishna told him, well, why don't you take the name of God at least in the morning and evening? He said openly, well, he can't be sure what time he gets up in the morning and when he goes to sleep. So Sri Ramakrishna understood, though he was a drunkard and an indisciplined man, he was very sincere. Here is a very interesting characteristic, When we are aware of our own drawbacks in spiritual life, it gives an opening for further progress. Suppose Girijendra Ghosh was a hypocrite who said, well, I shall act according to your instruction. I shall take the name of God every day. He knew he won't be able to do that. But if he had played a trick upon himself, he would not have made any spiritual progress. He knew he won't be able to do that, he won't be able to keep the promise, and he openly admitted as much. So Sri Ramakrishna took the whole responsibility of a spiritual progress on his shoulders, and eventually you find he became a saintly figure. Now in this scene, Sri Ramakrishna is visiting the Star Theatre. Girish Chandra Ghosh wrote many plays, mostly depicting the life and teachings of saints and sages. Sri Ramakrishna was invited sometimes. He also went a few times to see some of those dramas depicting the lives and teachings of great saints of ancient times. Here's a conversation. Sri Ramakrishna says, there are signs by which you can know whether a man has truly seen God. One of these signs is joy. There is no hesitancy in him. He is like the ocean. The waves and sounds are on the surface. Below are profound depths. The man who has seen God behaves sometimes like a madman, sometimes like a ghoul without any feeling of purity or impurity, sometimes like an inert thing remaining speechless because he sees God within and without, sometimes like a child. So, Sri Ramakrishna is here expounding a great, profound teaching that is found in many of the ancient traditional scriptures. It is said a great spiritual person who feels the presence of God within himself and everywhere. He transcends all formalities. Formalistic worship is necessary for everyone at the beginning, but it is not the end of spiritual life. It's not that by becoming informal we become spiritual, no. When we transcend the lower levels of spiritual growth, we reach a stage when spiritual tendency, spiritual practice, higher spiritual ideas, spiritual thought currents become natural to us. At that time, there is no need to practice formal worship, because the purpose of going to temple or a church is to find a place which is convenient, which is free from the marketplace, where everything is peaceful and calm, so that we can go and pray. We can't do that. The beginner in spiritual life cannot sit on the street and pray, because his mind will be disturbed. He cannot sit in a marketplace because he will be disturbed. So he goes to a church or a temple or a meditation, a place where meditation is taking place, because he is in need of some formal, convenient places, companions, friends, and fellow spiritual seekers. He needs their company. But going beyond that, when we start seeing the presence of God outside the place of worship, when we start practicing spirituality, even when we are not in the temple or in the meditation room, even when we are engaged in work in a factory or office or anywhere else, then there is no need to practice formal worship. At that time, you feel nothing but the presence of God everywhere. So it gives a tremendous joy. That's why it is said in the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and also in the Gita and other books, Patanjali calls it Chitta Prasada. Chitta Prasada means a feeling of total relaxation, inner tranquility, a joy and inner blissfulness. And the word used in Gita is Santosha. Santushta Satadam Yogi Yadatma Dhruva. Lord Krishna says, one of the great signs of a great devotee is he has a feeling of inner tranquility, contentment within. Yes, Sri Ramakrishna says, one of these signs is a joy. That's why you may remember that interesting incident when Swami Vivekananda was preaching in the United States. One of his hosts, perhaps, asked him a question. Swamiji, why are you so free, so joyful? Because a spiritual teacher was supposed to be very grim, with a strong, somber expression, should not cut jokes. He should be always, because he has to show a very serious, grim expression. And Swamiji, of course, in a light vein, he replied, I also become green and sad when I have a stomach pain. But that was a way of, a lighter way of responding. Later Swamiji must have explained. Because when we feel that we are a devotee of God, or when we are a spiritual seeker, when we are trying to seek the highest spiritual truth, that feeling should give us a feeling of inner contentment, joy. This is not a joy that is associated with some attainments or accomplishment of something great in the material world. When people get money, when they get status, when they get promotion, people sometimes feel joy. But that joy is short-lived. Because when you join the office, you find there is a higher officer ahead of you. Then the joy is gone. So promotion, the joy that we get when we get promotion is short-lived. When the richest man also becomes unhappy because he finds there is a richer man still somewhere else. So in the relative world, it is not really possible to have absolute joy. Any kind of joy or happiness that we get in this relative world is also relative. So one important sign of a truly great spiritual seeker, and especially of those who have seen God or had progressed in spiritual life, is joy. It's like the ocean. The waves and sounds are on the surface. Below are profound depths. The man who has seen God behaves like a madman. This is a statement. This should be understood very carefully. Because madness of spirituality is different from madness as it is understood in psychiatry. When a spiritual seeker feels that the whole world is his creation, God's creation, God is present everywhere, and everything is God's play, and he is also one of the actors in this mighty drama of God's play, then that gives him a kind of transcendental joy and happiness. So he transcends all formalistic do's and don'ts. It doesn't mean that he will behave always in an odd way, but his behavior cannot be and should not be judged by the normal parameters or judgment criteria that are normally the norms in material world. You find a very interesting scene in the Gospel itself. Sri Ramakrishna says, once a great spiritual genius, realized soul, a jnani, man of spiritual wisdom, came to the Dakshineswar temple. He was moving about. Such great mendicants are called avadhutas or jnanis. A little of that you find in ancient Greece. Demosthenes, you might have heard of Demosthenes. There are stories of great Greek men of wisdom. One of them was Demosthenes used to go about with a lighted candle in daytime. Somebody asked him what's the matter. He wanted to see a man, a real man. He couldn't see any real man anywhere. In fact, through that act, he was teaching the world that real man is different from real human being. A real human being should be a person of wisdom and transcendental knowledge. That was what he was trying to drive home. So, in Vedantic tradition, you find the highest jnani sometimes behaves in a way which is different from the normal behavior pattern. So Sri Ramakrishna says, sometimes he behaves like a madman. We may think it that way, but it may not be madness. It's a kind of spiritual ecstasy. You can read Sri Ramakrishna's life. He closes his eyes and speaks certain things which are really supreme universal truths. Normally when people engage in conversation, they may be speaking truths, but these truths are relative truths related to the relative plane normal worldly life situations. But a jnani could see with his inner eye certain absolute transcendental truths which go beyond time, space and causation. So when he is in communion with that supreme truth, he speaks certain things which normal people may interpret to be somewhat abnormal. So you find in Sri Ramakrishna's life, he closes his eyes in a state of samadhi. Sometimes he tells his devotees, well, you will achieve your goal. And that devotee feels that his prayers are answered. Sometimes Sri Ramakrishna puts his, he blesses the devotees. Yeah, your prayers will be answered. Sometimes he gives some instructions. All that you find. Even Yam, in Yam case something happened. Yesterday we were reading. After some time, after some days of acquaintance, Sri Ramakrishna understood what was happening in Yam's mind. This man had left his home, family, was thinking of putting an end to his life, and suddenly he happened to meet his teacher, Sri Ramakrishna, that gave him a new life. In course of time, Sri Ramakrishna, in one of his conversations with Yam, said, well, if you have strong faith in God, the essence of the statement, then all problems, all miseries, all agonies in this life will vanish like a cloud. When a strong wind blows, the patches of dark clouds vanish. Similarly, when God's grace descends on you, all the agonies and miseries in this material world will vanish. Sri Ramakrishna made this statement in a transcendental mode. Now, he didn't make this statement talking to him in the eyes and as in normal conversation. From a transcendental state, ecstatic state, he made this statement. So that's what's meant by stay here. They behave in a manner which is different from the normal behavior patterns of people living in this mundane world. Sometimes like a goal. Again, goals are supernatural beings, remaining speechless because he sees God within and without. Sometimes totally speechless without speaking anything. And sometimes he engages in vigorous conversation on spiritual topics with the devotees and visitors. Sometimes like a child. Child is a classic example of informal behavior. It is said that only two types of people can behave in a very informal manner. The child and the jnani, a higher spiritual soul. Because a highly evolved spiritual seeker doesn't find any need or meaning in becoming very, very formalistic, formal in behavior. A child also can have the same joy. Child can be happy without any real cause. His joy is natural characteristic, small children. And again, there is no rational explanation for some of the activities or behavior patterns of children. So also, the higher spiritual seekers behave in a manner which are inexplicable by normal standards. We try to explain and then we say it is abnormal. But our judgment is lopsided. We are judging everything from a lower standpoint of intellect. I mean, called perception and inference. We try to understand and we try to analyze, which is a very lower level of cognition. But the higher spiritual seekers see and understand things from a higher standpoint, so that their behavior sometimes may appear to be somewhat informal. Sometimes he behaves like a child without any attachment, wandering about unconnectedly with his cloth under his arm. Again, in the mood of the child, he acts in a different way. Sometimes like a boy, indulging in frivolity. Sometimes like a young man, working and teaching with the strength of a lion. Sometimes they may be teaching preaching the highest spiritual truths, and sometimes they may be in intro mode. Remember, this is not something that people should practice and rehearse. That's a very interesting thing. And there is a reason why I'm making this statement. After Sri Ramakrishna's passing away, Swamiji found out that some aged disciples, household disciples, were trying to rehearse samadhi within closed doors. And then Swamiji actually tried to correct them, and in rare cases even expose them. Don't do that. This is not something that we should practice and attain. This is a stage that we naturally attain. Not that every person behaves like this. Sri Ramakrishna says, sometimes we come across highly enlightened spiritual souls behaving in a manner which may be different from the normal behavior patterns. That's what he's referring to. Man cannot see God on account of ego. You cannot see the sun when a cloud rises in the sky. But that doesn't mean there is no sun. The sun is there all the same. Now, there are two types of egos which Sri Ramakrishna refers to in the Gospel. The higher spiritual, sublimated ego and the normal ego. Very often, ego becomes a great obstacle. So when ego becomes predominant, then God actually withdraws his role. Because God can function through us only when our own ego stands out, allowing God's power to function through us. Then only a devotee really can get any benefit from sincere prayer. Prayer, the psychology of prayer is this. In prayer, what is happening is our ego is slowly erased, and God's power takes its place. And then and its effect is called grace. Grace is nothing but the operation of God's power in the mind of a devotee whose ego is erased. But when the ego remains dominant in the devotee, then God cannot enter, because both cannot coexist in the same place. That's the idea behind it. It is a normal ego as an obstacle in spiritual life. But there is another ego which Sri Ramakrishna will refer to in the coming pages. The same ego which normally stands as an obstacle in spiritual life can be sublimated, can be refined, and become a great help in spiritual life. Well, I am a spiritual seeker. I should not behave in a particular manner. I should behave only in a certain manner. I should not do certain things. I should do certain things. Now this ego, for example, it is necessary and it is sometimes very helpful at the beginning of spiritual life. We should not start our spiritual life behaving like madmen, behaving in a very informal manner. That is a very serious danger. See, often we used to refer to this point, the conflict between mind and intellect. Very often when we read a book, we come across these great spiritual ideas. We sometimes delude ourselves into thinking that we have reached that stage. We have only intellectually cognized that idea, that concept. We should not imagine that we have actually reached that stage. We reach that stage only when we mentally reach that state. Because 99% of our life is at mental level, not intellectual level. Intellect gets acquainted with a great idea. See, everything is Brahman, or God is within us, or God is all-pervading reality. It's a great spiritual truth taught in Advaita Vedanta. We read this, we may read higher technical books of Advaita like Bhagavad Gita, Yoga Vasishtha, Adhyatma Ramayana, and many such books, which normally give only the conclusions of Advaita Vedanta, which tells you God is one, omnipresent, all-pervading, immanent, transcendental, attributeless, formless reality. This body, this mind, the intellect, these are all superimpositions. Wonderful, no doubt. And when we read it, it is very captivating. In fact, there is one verse in the Mandukya Karika, na nirodho na chotpatti na bandho na cha sadhaka na mumukshur na vai muktaha ityesha paramarthata. The meaning is this: there is no bondage, there is no need of liberation, there is no spiritual seeker, there is neither dissolution nor creation, neither bondage nor liberation, no need to be a spiritual seeker, because we are already liberated. Spiritual illumination, spiritual truth is our birthright. Everything else is an alien superimposition. Spiritual enlightenment is not the result of any action. If it were the result of an action, it would be relative. It is already our natural gift by birth. This is certainly the final, the conclusive statement in Advaita Vedanta. Gaudapada makes this point clear in Mandukya Karika, Gaudapada Karika. Now, if you read this, then there is nothing else to do. No need to read books, no need to meditate, no need to pray. That's a terrible misunderstanding. It is a terrible deception, because this is right now only an intellectual idea for us, an intellectual concept. Our mind is still at a very, very low level. Our ego may not allow us to admit this fact. Nobody wants to admit that he belongs to a lower level. We want highest, the best, and right now, at this moment. So, Vedanta says, right now we must read all this, meditate and understand the meaning, and then we must try to slowly practice, beginning with the beginning itself. So, at that level, at the beginning, we must meditate, we must pray, we must read the scriptures, we must contemplate, we must discuss these topics, these subjects with fellow spiritual seekers, fellow spiritual pilgrims, and try to enrich and reinforce our own mind with these spiritual vibrations and ideas. And slowly, the mind which is now at a very low level, the mind will slowly start moving forward. And the technique of bridging the gap between where the mind remains and where the intellect stands, this process is called spiritual practice, spiritual sadhana. It is called sadhana chatushtayam, and different sravana, manana, nididhyasana. We must hear, contemplate, and meditate, and so on. Now, for this we need some kind of an ego. What kind of ego? Well, I must not be obsessed. I should not become a slave of my senses. I should not become a slave of the sensory objects. I must concentrate on spiritual practices. I must read scriptures. I must discuss spiritual topics. Without this strong determination, we again need a little bit of ego. We cannot even practice spirituality. So ego sometimes can become a great help and guide. But Sri Ramakrishna says that ego is sometimes helpful. In another context, if you have ego, well, you give a promotion to the ego. You become a servant of God. That's a very high promotion. Otherwise, that ego belongs at the very low level. A very interesting story is there in the Bhagavad Purana, how a small boy reached the highest spiritual experience by sublimating his ego. The story sometimes called Dhruva, means the story of the little boy Dhruva. Sister Nivedita gives a very touching, very graphic description of Dhruva's story in the Cradle Tales of Hinduism, you find. If you want to read the original book, you find Bhagavad Gita, you go to the 4th skandha, this 4th book, from 8th chapter to 12th chapter. In 5 chapters, Vyasa gives a graphic description of the story of a little boy who sublimated his ego, and with the refined ego, he had a vision of God and he became a great devotee. He was born in a princely family. His father had 2 wives, Suriji and Suniti. But he was not very impartial. He was prejudiced towards his elder wife and her son Dhruva. So, due to, I need not go into further details, one day the little boy tried to sit at the lap of his father, and his stepmother ill-treated him, and he wept and cried. He went to his mother Suniti, and that mother told him, see, if you, all these things are due to our own previous karmas. If you want a solution to all these problems, pray to God. God will solve all your problems. A little boy of 5 years, this was the instruction he received. He didn't have the intellect to rationally analyze. Then he would not become the great Dhruva. Straight away he believed. He was a pure little boy. And he started his journey to the forest. And he was walking in the forest. As he was walking in the forest, an aged man, a great sage, his name was Narada, appeared before him. So this sage saw this little boy walking at a distance. He knew that there is something wrong with this child. I must help him. Then he came to the boy. What's the matter? Why are you walking alone in this dense forest? The boy told him his story. He was ill-treated by his father and his stepmother. So his mother told him, you go to the forest, you meditate on God, and God will solve your problems. Narada was very happy at heart. So Aho Teja Kshatriyanam, Narada exclaims, what a power of determination in this little boy of Kshatriya clan. Anyway, but Narada wanted to test him. So that is the crux of the subject here. Narada wanted to test him. He asked the boy, so what's the matter with you? You are a little boy. These domestic quarrels are very common everywhere. You go back to your palace and I will talk to your father. I will solve all the problems. You cannot practice penance, meditation and realize God in this small age. You can't do that. In fact, Narada was trying to test whether the boy was really fit for this spiritual practice or not. Because a devotee of God should have strong will, strong determination. That strong will and strong determination is a sublimated aspect of creative, constructive ego. Without this creative and constructive sublimated ego, no one can go ahead in spiritual life or of course in material life. Everyone knows that. So, when Narada tried to dissuade him, Dhruva said, no, I shall not return to my palace without my prayers answered. Then Narada taught him how to meditate, how to do spiritual practices, and Dhruva meditated for 6 months, and at the end of 6 months, he realized he had a vision of Vishnu, God himself, and God blessed him that your prayers will be fulfilled, your desires will be fulfilled. Of course, Dhruva did not ask for the highest spiritual truth. He was a little boy. But it shows that even a little boy with sublimated ego could get a vision of God. At the end of 6 months, he got a vision of Lord Vishnu, and he started his prayer. Yonta Parivishya Mamavajamimam Prasuktam Sanjeevayeti Akhila Shakti Dharasudha. This famous Dhruva Stuti comes in the Bhagavad Gita. So the story is this, the message of the story is this: without creative, constructive channelization, refinement of our ego, we cannot go ahead in spiritual life. That's why Sri Ramakrishna said again and again, if there is ego within you, if the ego remains, you make him the servant, the refined spiritual ego. I am the servant of God. That ego, that will be helpful. The other ego is a stumbling block, a great obstacle in spiritual life. So long as the non-creative, unrefined ego remains within us, God will never enter our heart. Both cannot coexist. So Sri Ramakrishna continues his conversation. So I said to Keshav Chandrasen, who is a famous social reformer, the leader of Brahma Samaj, a devotee of Sri Ramakrishna, if I tell you more than I have already said, you won't be able to keep your organization together. He was the head of a particular group, dispensation of Brahma Samaj. He, in fact, he had some difference of opinion with the Adi Brahma Samaj, the more conservative wing of the Brahma Samaj movement. And Keshav Chandrasen was a more modern person. He was the leader and the founder of the modern dispensation of Brahma Samaj. So Sri Ramakrishna says, if you destroy all ego, then you won't be able to put your organization together. So to live in this world, to work, at the same time to practice spirituality, you need this refined, sublimated, spiritualized version of ego. That's what Sri Ramakrishna says. He who has seen God finds that God alone has become the world and all its living beings. It is he who has become all. Such a person is called a superior devotee. Girish and Ghosh replies, yes, God is everything, but the devotee keeps a trace of ego that's not harmful. Sri Ramakrishna says, smiling, yes, there is no harm in that. That trace of ego is kept in order to enjoy God. He is speaking about the higher devotees. See, in devotional experience, if you feel total identity with God, you won't be able to enjoy your servantship or your status as a devotee of God. So devotees normally keep a distinction. Then Sri Ramakrishna says, the highest devotee is one who sees God everywhere and who sees himself in God. Then there is also the devotee of the mediocre class. He sees that God dwells in all beings as their inner guide. So, but they say God lives everywhere, but they are not able to see the whole universe as an expression of the divine. That's possible only for the highest devotee. But the inferior devotee says God exists, he is up there. That is to say beyond the sky. The lowest type of devotee. Lowest doesn't mean the most contempt type. No. Beginning, the early state, early phase of a spiritual evolution. We should not say here the word inferior is used. It doesn't mean that it is bad or undesirable. What Sri Ramakrishna means is, at the beginning of spiritual life, we may sometimes believe that God's presence is felt in the temple, the church, the synagogue, or in any place of worship. God will be happy when we read sacred book, holy book, and we have to believe certain things, we have to follow certain rituals, and if we don't do that, then it's against the tradition of our religion. This is, of course, the beginning, But this should not be the end. We have to begin somewhere. Otherwise, how do we practice spirituality? Normally, our senses, our mind are distracted in all directions. So these senses and mind should be brought back and they should be given a focus. A person who is highly distracted, but never worshipped, but never prayed, never meditated, never visited any place of worship. If you tell him, well, God lives everywhere, it doesn't make any sense to him. This idea makes sense only to a devotee who had for a long time practiced the earlier levels of spiritual practices. Who meditated for a long time, done a lot of pilgrimages, read holy books. Such devotees who have reached a high level of evolution will understand the true meaning of the statement when you tell him, well, God lives everywhere. But a person who has not even started the journey, whose mind is naturally distracted everywhere, in all directions. Mind cannot stay focused on one spiritual idea. Such a person cannot understand higher spiritual truth. So such people need a focus. Mind is being dragged in all directions by the eyes, by the ears, by the sense of touch, sense of smell, and all five senses are simultaneously dragging the mind in all directions. So the first step is to withdraw this mind from these worldly distractions. For that we need a counter focus. Instead of sensory objects, another focus, another object of concentration should be provided. For that, well, you say, instead of you take a decision, every day I will read Gita or the Bible or any scripture, every day. Or every day I will pray for half an hour. If one goes on practicing this, then mind gets another higher focus. Distractions will slowly decrease and mind gets slowly focused. He said, water is everywhere on earth, but if you want to drink water, you have to dig a well. 3/4 of the world of the earth is water. It doesn't mean that you can drink without digging, but if you can drink water from everywhere. If we want to drink water, we need to dig a well and purify the water. Similarly, the mind that is distracted in all directions is scattered like mustard seed, going everywhere. So these distractions should be reduced. And for that, the same eyes, the same ears, the same senses of perception, which are normally dragging the mind to sensory objects, the same senses of perception can be utilized to focus the mind on a higher topic. So when you try to see good spiritually, helpful, healthy sights or visions. We want to try to hear spiritually useful sounds. Reading scriptures, reading hymns, reading prayers and so on. So the same senses can be given a better job to concentrate and to work with spiritually conducive, healthy objects, sounds, ears and experiences. That will give the mind another point of concentration, another focus. This is the first step. And then slowly we try to evolve. And for giving this counter focus for the mind, we need to go to a place of worship, whether it is a temple, church or whatever may be, or we may have to read certain books, we have to practice certain rituals. This is the slow process of sublimating ego. That's why Sri Ramakrishna says such devotees will tell you God is there sitting in the temple, not here. He is there, that is his residence. Nothing wrong in it, but this is only the beginning of spiritual life. A very graphic description is given in the spiritual classic Bhagavad Purana. These are according to some of our great senior monks of the order. The Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna can be compared with the famous spiritual classic, devotional classic, which is written around 8th or 7th century AD. It's called Bhagavad Purana, which has 12 sections. There's an interesting description of this sublimation of or creative channelization of ego in devotional life, spiritual life. A conversation, a dialogue between 9 sages and a king, an emperor. It is sometimes called as Nimi Navayogi Samvadaha, means a conversation, a dialogue between an emperor, a king called Nimi, and 9 sages. The king asks several questions, 9 questions, and for each question, each of the 9 sages gives an answer. So one of the questions was, what are the characteristics of an ideal devotee? It's related to the topic of sublimation of creative, constructive diversion of natural tendencies in the ecosystem. In answer to this, a great sage called Antariksha gives the answer. The list of the sages is mentioned in one verse. Kabiravi Antariksha Prabhuta Pipalayanaha Avihotroda Dimidas Chamasa Karabhajanaha. 9 sages, that's good. Need not bother now. So a great sage called Antariksha discusses this subject. He says, the highest devotee is one who sees the presence of the whole creation in God and the presence of God in all beings. So the presence of God is experienced everywhere and everything is experienced in God. Sarva bhudeshu ya pasyet bhagavad bhavamatmanaha bhudani bhagavadi atmani esha bhagavadottama. The highest devotee is called Bhagavadottama, is one who sees the presence of God in all beings and the presence of all beings in God. This is the culmination of all spiritual practices, whether yoga, karma yoga, bhakti yoga, jnana yoga or raja yoga. This experience of total identity, unity and oneness of existence. So that's why Sri Ramakrishna says, the highest devotee is one who understands that God has become the world and all its beings, and therefore God is seen everywhere and everything is seen in God. But then there are devotees who belong to a lower order, who are aspirants to reach this higher level. They have not reached that stage. They should be very careful. They cannot practice the highest devotional philosophy at the beginning of their devotional life, spiritual evolution. So they should be very careful. So the sage Antariksha says, Ishvare tadadhineshu balisheshu disutsucha prema maitri kripa upeksha yakkarodi samadhyamaha. Who is the middle-level devotee? He is trying to reach the highest level, the level in which he sees the presence of God everywhere and everything in God. But he has not reached. But he is slowly making progress. He should be very careful. He should be devoted to God. And he should be very friendly with fellow devotees, with other spiritual seekers. That's why mutual discussion among spiritual seekers, spiritual aspirants, keeping company with spiritual aspirants, and discussion and exchange of ideas on spiritual topics is very much necessary and is a great help in spiritual life. So one should be devoted to God and one should be friendly with fellow devotees. And then one should have sympathy, understanding and compassion towards those who are interested in spiritual life but who may not have yet endured that life, who may not have understood it. So one should try to help them to come to spiritual path. Then there is a fourth category. If you talk, why don't you go for retreat or retreat, what's the use of it all? Absolute worthless, they will say. Whatever you tell them, they will give a negative argument. Everything is crossed. Everything is negated. So, at the beginning you may feel, I won't be affected by this person's negative views. But slowly when you keep association with them, slowly, well, after all there is some truth in what he says. Maybe this spirituality or these things are mere superstitions, perhaps. And slowly, eventually, we may be converted into his view or her view. So, these are the people who try to drag us away from spiritual life. And the great sage Antariksha says, we must keep a long distance from them. You should not try to convert them, then they will convert you. So very often that happens. But we should not antagonize them, because even a confrontation is some kind of interaction. That also can be harmful. So we have to keep a long distance. So negative ideas should be always avoided. We may not get positive encouragement, positive ideas from everywhere. But negative ideas should be always kept at a distance, should be scrupulously avoided. Sri Ramakrishna makes that point very clear in many contexts. Swami Vivekananda in Bhakti Yoga lecture says indifference, indifference, indifference. He uses the same word 3 times. It's not a full sentence. Indifference, indifference, indifference. So, Sri Ramakrishna says these are 3 levels of spiritual practice. There are those who have already started a spiritual journey, who are interested in formal spiritual practices. And then there are those who slowly evolve, and there are those who have reached the final stage of devotional life. There are 2 types of Paramahamsas, the Jnani and Premi. Jnani is self-centered, he feels that it's enough to have knowledge for his own sake. The Premi, like Sukadeva, after attaining his own realization, teaches men. Some eat mangoes and wipe off the traces from their mouths. The other may find, you have eaten mango, you give me, where do you get the mangoes? So, there are people, they don't want to take the risk. So they don't want to show that they have eaten mangoes. There are some spiritual seekers who may not like the idea of sharing their spiritual tendencies, spiritual ideas with others. Sri Ramakrishna says it is not the correct way. One should constantly remember death. Nothing will survive death. We are born into this world to perform certain duties, like the people who come from the countryside to Calcutta on business. If a visitor goes to a rich man's garden, the superintendent says to him, this is our garden, this is our lake, and so forth. But if the superintendent is dismissed for some misdeed, he can't carry away even his mango wood chest. He sends it secretly by the gatekeeper. It's a very interesting, very humorous way of putting a great spiritual truth. Sri Ramakrishna says, now, very often we have a totally negative concept of understanding of this mysterious phenomenon of death. Is death something that is so scary, that should frighten us? Sri Ramakrishna says, of course in Vedantic tradition, death is not the end of the journey of human life. death is only a comma, not even a semicolon. Because it is only a comma, it's certainly not a full stop. Because whatever little good deeds we have done in this life, that will remain in our account. Even a little bit of spiritual practice, prayer, meditation, or noble deeds, unselfish deeds or unselfish thoughts, all these, if you have done even a little, will have its good result in the next life. That's one of the important points of Vedantic concept of life, the concept of cyclicism of existence at the macro level and also micro level. The cosmos comes into existence from the subtle. From the subtle, it becomes manifest. When it becomes gross, it goes back to subtle. It's called dissolution. So, Srishti is nothing but projection from subtle towards gross. The projected state is called existence. Going back to the subtle state is called dissolution. It's called pralaya. Similarly, life moves not in a straight line but in a cycle. We are born with certain characteristics and tendencies which determine our behavior, character, the way we live, the attitudes and desires and tendencies that we entertain. We enrich or impoverish these tendencies by our actions in this life. And then when we are dead, we are reborn again to continue the journey till we reach the highest spiritual truth, that we are not this body, we are the infinite, omnipresent Atman. When that truth is realized, this cyclic movement, rotation comes to an end. This is the Vedantic concept of life, based on cyclicism. Now, Sri Ramakrishna says, death gives a very important message. It teaches us one great message. The message is the perishable nature of the body and the imperishable nature of Atman. Death teaches two lessons. One lesson is this body is perishable, but even when the body is no more, there is an imperishable Atman that remains intact, that continues his journey even after death. There's a great promise also in the 6th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. You find this promise. Arjuna asked a very interesting question to Krishna. A very simple question which anybody may ask. The question is this: what happens to those who try to do some spiritual practices but do not fully succeed and pass away before they reach the final goal? Ayadi Shraddhayo Pedo Yoga Chalidamanasaha Aprapi Yoga Samsiddhim Kam Gadim Krishna Gechadi. The 6th chapter, Arjuna asked this question. A spiritual seeker who sincerely tries to practice meditation, japa, prayers and so on. What happens to him when he dies without achieving anything? Kachinno bhavibrashta siddhnabha vivanasyadi apradishto mahabhavu vimudho brahmanapati. This is a question. Will he become a bhavibrashta? Means he has lost this world and also the next. There is an imagery given, an example. Patches of clouds scattered away by strong winds, storms. They completely vanish and merge into nothingness. Similarly, whatever little spiritual practices we have done in this life, meditation, prayer, reading, attending retreats, all this, reading of scriptures, discussion, spiritual ideas, all this will come to nothing. Is that going to happen if we don't achieve the supreme goal of God realization before death? Krishna's answer is very important. He says, Nahi kalyanakut kaschid durgadim tadagachati. even a little bit of spiritual practices you do in this life will remain intact. Nothing will be lost. If you have done a little meditation, if you have attended a few retreats, if you have read some holy scriptures, or if you have even without meditation or japa or anything, we have helped some philanthropic societies, the Red Cross or Lions or the UNESCO's health programs in third world countries. These are not often done by spiritual seekers, by philanthropists. Even such noble deeds of philanthropy, generosity, not only spiritual practices, all these activities will create a spiritual bank in your name, a spiritual capital, and this will remain intact. So those who have done a lot of meditation and japa in this life but may not be able to reach the supreme goal before their death, they will be reborn again and they will be able to continue their spiritual journey, and they can draw checks on the strength of this spiritual capital they have built up in this life. So that's a great promise which Lord Krishna gives, which means life is not a straight line progression. We have to remember this, and it's very important, because very often our view of life is colored by a merciless, a most uncompromising doctrine. In this life, if you can't do something, you are doomed, you are damned. One chance. Just imagine a God, He gives you only one chance, and to err is human. And if you don't see a long high jump athlete, if he makes only one chance, if he is not able to reach the qualifying mark, and if he's suspended from the team, just imagine. So we are given infinite opportunities. It doesn't mean that we should have complacency. No, complacency is not advocated or encouraged. But there is no scope for depression or disappointment. There is no hellfire waiting for you. Because even a little bit of spiritual practice you have done will remain in our accounts. So, that's why Sri Ramakrishna says, death can be a great teacher, a wise sage. Death can be looked upon as a creative crisis and a wise sage and wise teacher who teaches well. This body comes and goes. Life is not something that begins with the cradle and ends up with a piece of stone in the burial ground. Life continues even beyond that. But Sri Ramakrishna says one should constantly remember death, not to be afraid of that, but remember that this body comes and goes, but there is something which is imperishable, which is eternal, that continues to exist even after death. We are born into this world to perform certain duties, like the people who come from the countryside to Calcutta on business. It's an example. Calcutta was the most prominent, most important city of undivided Bengal at that time. So people used to come to the big city to do some business. They won't stay there. They will go back to their village, maybe hundreds of miles away. Like that, we have come to this city to do some business. It may be 100 years, the lucky ones. But 100 years also is a very short period of time in this infinity of time. If a visitor goes to a rich man's garden, the superintendent says, this is our garden. See, if you go to a big rich man's palatial place, he may take you around. But not the owner of the palace, but his gardener, maybe his paid servant, may take you around. This is our garden, this is our, and so on. But next day perhaps he may lose his job and he may have to come there as a visitor. But today he is taking you around as if the building belongs to him. Similarly, this world doesn't really belong to us. If we can keep this momentariness or transitoriness of this world and our own life, that's a great guarantee for morality. In fact, if the best way to enforce morality is not to use the police force, but teach the people the truth that this life is not eternal. Because very often we are so closely identified with the present moment that if something happens now, we think now is the only time. The present is the only thing that exists. We cannot look beyond, or we won't look backward. This identity with the present, with the now, is the cause of many of the problems you are facing. So Sri Ramakrishna says, we must keep our eyes fixed on the infinite, not on the finite. And the best way to remember the importance of spiritual practices is to constantly remember death. I should remind you again and again, because in Abrahamic tradition, death is a terrible thing. It is not only the end of everything, it's the beginning of something much worse. So, but in Vedanta, death is only just like moving from one room to another room. So anybody can practice spirituality any day, any moment. Sometimes it's called, you are never late and nothing will be lost. Anybody can start a new chapter in spiritual life, any day, any time. It doesn't mean that we should be complacent, but it means there is no room for worry or anxiety. So we will have interaction now. We'll continue the discussion tomorrow.
Swami, so you said there was they viewed death as terrible. Where was that, or who was that? And then Ramakrishna had a new view. Is that right? What you just said about who viewed death? Who viewed death as a terrible event?
Oh no, really normally people are afraid of death.
Yes.
Death is the most terrifying phenomenon.
Yes.
For everyone. But Sri Ramakrishna says death, on the other hand, can be looked upon as a wise sage who reminds us of the transitoriness of everything in this world other than Atman or God.
Yes. Okay.
Because death, death means the end of the physical body.
Yes.
But it also reminds the continued existence of something which doesn't come to an end with the physical body.
Yes.
That's it.
When you were saying that, you referred to the Brahmanic tradition or something.
Yeah.
Brahmanic tradition or something.
Abrahamic.
Abraham.
Yeah, Abrahamic tradition. I was talking about Abrahamic tradition, Abrahamic religious tradition.
Yes.
Life is only one. There is no cyclical concept of existence. Life is just one. In fact, this is many of the fundamental Vedantic teachings will become clear to us only when we keep this in mind. In Vedantic tradition, life, human existence is interpreted as a cycle, not as a straight line progression, beginning at one point and ending at another point. That's the idea.
In some ways, Swami, you mentioned, the idea is that you see God in everyone and everything in God. The first statement, see God in everything, that is intellectually easily conceived of. But how do you conceive of everything in God, intellectually?
Yes. Well, if God has become everything, then everything has a relationship with God. So, God permeates everything, pervades everywhere. Pervades as Antaryami, as the immanent principle. The omnipresence takes place through the mechanism of immanence. See, omnipresence, all-pervading nature of something can be interpreted in two ways. One is covering on the surface. The other is existing within as the essence of everything. It's a much deeper way of interpreting omnipresence. Omnipresence can be interpreted through the principle of immanence and also through the principle of cover, external covering. But in Vedanta, it is interpreted as the immanence. The essence, the inner essence of everything is God. In that sense, there is nothing in this world other than God. Which God is omnipresent. That's the idea. So, how do we interpret the omnipresent principle? The omnipresent principle is to be interpreted through in the light of the principle of immanence. Immanence, antaryami, within, existing within as the essence, the gist of everything. See, look at gold. In a gold ornament, gold is omnipresent, but gold is also it is immanent. If you break it, there is a gold within. It is so the omnipresent characteristic of gold in a golden ornament could be interpreted as its immanent aspect. That's the idea. If everything is God, then God is everything.
Swami, I had a question. I understand that anything that you do, all the spiritual practices that you do in this life, in reading of scriptures and everything. What about there are people, I've seen a few people in India, where they actually read scriptures, but their attitude isn't right. What happens to those people?
Attitude is not right.
Yeah.
No, that's true. That means they are not spiritually evolved. But still, they are better than those whose attitudes are bad, still don't read scripture. So that's why if everyone has a place. Lord Krishna makes a statement, everyone has a place. So, as I said, people who turn to God, turn to spiritual life, to escape from the problems of the world, are certainly superior to those who try to find an escape route in drugs and alcohol. So you can find yourself. Krishna makes this point, Udara Sarvaiva iti. There are people, Lord Krishna makes an interesting statement. He says there are people who turn to God for money, for wealth. And there are those who turn to God out of some sickness, some dire needs, compulsions. And there are those, of course, who are inquisitive and also who are knowledgeable. So even those who turn to God, even to pray for material wealth, they are turning to Him after they are not doing counterfeiting or anything like that. They pray to God, give me wealth. Those people are better than those who try to make wealth through other means. And Krishna makes a statement, they say, Udara Sarvayavaida. Even those people who turn to God for selfishness, they have a place in my empire. God has a place for everyone. That's the idea. Because even if a person prays to God for material wealth, selfish sense, he will be maybe indirectly, he may be practicing some morality, something. That's the idea. Oh, yes.
Swami, back to the different ways that an avatuta manifests. The child, the ghoul, the madman, the inert man.
Yes.
And you said we shouldn't imagine that we are those.
Excuse me?
We should not imagine that we are those
Yes,
people.
yes.
Well, I think that there is a spiritual practice in which you do imagine and thereby sublimate the ego, that you have these qualities, that you are happy for no reason, that you are innocent like a child, that you are trying to see the divine in everyone, so that you are asserting your true nature. You are the Atman. So
Yes.
why don't you behave
Yes,
like the
yes,
Atman?
Yes.
That's
Now,
imagination,
yes.
maybe,
Yes.
but it's the truth.
Yatiswaranandaji refers to the importance of imagination, the role that imagination plays in spiritual life. For a sincere spiritual seeker, imagination can be creative help. But what I was saying, sometimes when we read some of the highest non-dualistic, Advaitic philosophical ideas, when we read, we may develop a contemptuous attitude towards formal worship, formal ritualistic practices, etc. Imagining that that's what we are, we have reached there, that will be a self-deception. It will be like a child who tries to imagine that he has reached the PhD level. There's a great danger in that. In fact, in that kind of self-deception, what happens? We block our natural progress route. Our natural progress is blocked. And we delude ourselves into thinking to have become what we are not. So, this happens in, Swami Vivekananda gives a strong warning against this trend to those who practice extreme devotional rituals. See, those who sing and dance and forget themselves in the frenzy of congregational prayers and excited dancing and all that. Next moment, their mind comes down and hits the bottom with a touch, and they are lost. And Swamiji gives a hint to this phenomenon among the Vaishnavas, some of the practitioners. So that's why we should know where we stand. As a matter of fact, most spiritual teachers continue some kind of formal rituals even after reaching the highest. All people do not belong to this category. Sri Ramakrishna is here referring to certain spiritually enlightened people, jnanis and devotees, who live like this, who behave like this. But not all people. He himself prayed to Mother, "Mother, please don't make me like that." Do you remember that there is an incident in the Gospel? In the Gospel, Paramahamsa came from outside. He took a dip in the Ganga, did not remove water, and then he went about and he shared food with the leftover food with the dogs and other animals. And he was practically, he was living like an abnormal person, but he was a great jnani. Sri Ramakrishna could understand. But Sri Ramakrishna prayed to Mother, "Please don't make me like this." So in fact, all the greatest teachers of the world, they were extremely well poised and well balanced. All the great teachers, Lord Krishna, Shankaracharya, Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, these are all individual sadhakas, individual jnanis. But the great epoch makers, those who came to teach the world, others, they were very well balanced and they behaved with some balance. Remember the point? So, just by behaving like a madman, nobody becomes a Paramahamsa. It is easy.
A person could, excuse me, Swami, a person could take the mentality of a madman, which is fluid and not rigid, and think of this world as a place of drama, and you're playing, these people who are here with us, regular Vedantins, they are not really beginners if they come to Vedanta. You wouldn't want to come to Vedanta if you were really conservative religiously.
Right.
These people here are not going to say to themselves, I am God.
Yeah, that's
They're going to have a balanced view of things, but in order to realize their true self in everyday life, they could take up the thinking, the fluid thinking of a madman and not be so dead serious and conservative.
That is true. In fact, the idea this whole world, all this life is a 5 minutes play. Vivekananda used the word, it's a 5 minutes child play. In a way, that idea is very helpful in spiritual life, even in confronting worldly problems. After all, to be very frank, all that happens in this world, even the most difficult situations, are impermanent. It is very obvious to everyone. So it doesn't need even any imagination. But as you said, creative imagination can be a great help in spiritual life. Nikhilananda refers to that. What I was trying to remind you, see, Swamiji himself found out some people were trying to, I was referring to that. Then Swamiji corrected them. So that's what I was referring to. Sometimes there's a problem, and that's a real problem. When we intellectually try to understand, and when we understand something, we sometimes believe we have really reached that stage. That creates problems. In fact, that sometimes can be very risky. Advaita, as the people who have read this highest with non-dualistic philosophy, who pretended to reach that stage of experience, have created problems for the world in modern times. Not real teachers, but some, I don't want to name anybody.
So imagination can lead to delusion.
Yes, imagination can be. Imagination can be a creative help, but it could sometimes be a negative risk also, risk factor.
Swami, I just got the word that came to me is you're really talking about a form of hypocrisy, right? You know, that people, we think we are something that we're not. Is that
It's
sort
not
of a
maybe
form
that
of-
the hypocrisy is a very strong term used. They don't mean that,
Yeah,
but this is a possible problem which Patanjali also
Right.
refers in
right.
Patanjali Yoga Sutra. Sometimes, you can easily, when we read scriptures, when we practice for some time, especially in solitude, sometimes some strange ideas may come to mind, and we may be deluded into thinking that we have really reached that stage. There's a possibility of a risk, not that it happens to everyone. There's always a possibility of a risk, prophet syndrome and such problems.
Just thinking in the New Testament, so often Jesus will call the religious authorities, he calls them hypocrites, because they were preaching, but they weren't living
Yes,
it. They
yes.
weren't. Their life wasn't up to that level.
Yes. Jesus was a great spiritual revolutionary. Every prophet is a revolutionary because every prophet has to fight with this past. Some conservative, orthodox, cobwebs, But he brings forth a new interpretation. But he doesn't completely deviate from his past. I come to fulfill, not to destroy.
Right.
So there is a continuity, but at the same time, continuity with a difference. That's what every prophet tries to do. 5 minutes more we have got.
Swami, can you tell me, you made us, I think from Gaudapada, that you made a statement on that I'm not the.
Oh yes,
where-
yes.
where can you?
Gaudapada, that verse, you can find the text. Na nirodho, na chotpatti, na grantho, na cha sadhakaha, na mumukshu, na vai muktaha ittesha paramarthana. If you go to the index, you find the beginnings like this. Na nirodho, na chotpatti. Most probably it is in the 3rd chapter of Mandukya Karika. Another name is Dodapada Karika. It's a commentary in metrical form on Mandukya Upanishad. So it is the last conclusive statement of an Advaitic non-dualist who has reached the highest experience. But many people have come into trouble reading. I mean, misunderstanding. This is caused. It should not be good. That should be read along with Shankaracharya's commentary, which is very realistic, very philosophical. He bridges all the gaps, and he gives a very holistic, very rational interpretation to this verse. So, thank you now. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Order.